In the pre-Civil War South, men were dominant over women. Women were not allowed to vote. Women were not allowed to hold office. But women were allowed to buy, own, and sell slaves. As slave owners, women were just as brutal as men. Around 1800, the invention of the cotton gin made the cultivation of cotton profitable in the South. At the same time, cotton replaced wool as the fabric of choice for European clothing manufacturers. Cotton was a key component in Britain's Industrial Revolution. By the 1830s, the United States was the leading exporter of cotton in the world. The British textile industry was dependent on cotton, grown on southern plantations. British money markets financed America's cotton industry by selling bonds to investors around the world. Funds from European investors allowed southern plantations to purchase land, equipment, supplies, and slaves. In order to expand the cultivation of cotton, the federal government forcibly removed Native Americans from their homelands in the South. The removal of Native Americans opened up millions of acres of land in Mississippi for the cultivation of cotton. The federal government then sold the confiscated land to white settlers at cheap prices. These white settlers, which included women, then purchased slaves to cultivate cotton on their newly acquired land. This led to the Second Middle Passage, the migration of approximately 1 million slaves from Upper South states such as Virginia and Maryland to the Deep South's cotton plantations in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Slave traders, like Franklin and Armfield, sold slaves at slave auctions in New Orleans and Natchez on credit. In addition, banks in states such as Louisiana and Mississippi accepted slaves as collateral for loans. For example, a first-time purchaser of slaves could finance their purchase. Slave owners could use the slaves they already owned as collateral for the purchase of more slaves. Furthermore, the state of Louisiana encouraged banks to make slave-backed mortgages and guaranteed these mortgages in case of default by the borrower. Banks bundled these mortgages into bonds. Major U.S. and international banks then sold these bonds in New York, London, Paris, and Amsterdam to investors around the world. Borrowers could make their loan payments by selling the cotton cultivated on their land. Wealth could be created by purchasing more land and slaves. In the early 1830s, the global demand for cotton caused the price of slaves to boom. A slave who could have been purchased for less than $400 could be sold in New Orleans for $1,200 or more. While women could not vote, hold office, or secure lucrative employment, they could purchase slaves. Women could purchase slaves to cultivate cotton on their land. Some women purchased slaves and then made a profit from hiring them out to others. Women who owned brothels could purchase female slaves to work for them as prostitutes. Some women could use their ownership of slaves to attract a husband. At slave auctions, women strategically acquired enslaved women who were pregnant and unsold babies, who could be had for nothing as long-term investments. For married women, the legal concept of conventure meant that their property belonged to their husbands. To get around conventure, some women had their husbands sign a marriage settlement prior to marriage. A marriage settlement was similar to today's prenuptial agreements, in that it allowed a wife to keep control of her property and shield her property from her husband's creditors. Cultivating cotton was a risky industry because of reliance on huge amounts of debt, unpredictable annual cotton production, and the fluctuating price of cotton on overseas markets. The Panic of 1837 was one of the worst depressions in American history. It occurred when the supply of cotton produced on southern plantations exceeded the demand for cotton in Europe. The American economy did not recover until the mid-1840s. Many husbands found themselves in deep financial trouble. Some wives successfully sued in court to have their marriage settlements upheld in order to shield their property from their husbands' creditors. In her book, They Were Her Property: White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, Stephanie Jones Rogers UC Berkeley Associate Professor of History, states that white women were active owners, buyers, and sellers of enslaved people. According to Jones Rogers, female slave owners were taught as children by their slave-owning parents how to manage slaves. Some women were given their own personal slaves as children, and they were given additional slaves as they grew older. As children, these women witnessed slaves being punished and were allowed to punish slaves themselves. It is estimated that women made up 40% of the total number of slave owners in America. The typical female slave owner owned 10 or fewer slaves, which is comparable to the number of slaves owned by the typical male slave owner. Female slave owners were ruthless and fully invested in slavery. Martha Gibbs was the owner of a sawmill in Mississippi and owned a lot of slaves. At the end of the Civil War, once the Confederates had surrendered to the Union, Gibbs moved some of her slaves to Texas at gunpoint. She then forced those slaves to work for an entire year, before setting them free in 1866. In her 2008 book, Out of the House of Bondage, The Transformation of the Plantation Household, Thalia Glimpf, a Peabody Family Distinguished Professor of History at Duke University, demonstrated that white women harassed, beat, maimed, tortured, and killed enslaved people with as much brutality and impunity as white men. A case in point of the cruelty white women could inflict on enslaved people is New Orleans' Madame Delphine Lalaurie. Delphine Lalaurie, born in 1787, was a popular New Orleans socialite of Creole background. Her neighbors were shocked to learn that she had tortured and abused enslaved men and women in her French Quarter home. Although she escaped and left the country, her home, Lalaurie Mansion, remains one of New Orleans' most famous structures. Lalaurie tortured and possibly murdered multiple enslaved persons at her French Quarter mansion. Lalaurie is one of New Orleans' most notorious women. She had 12 of her slaves die in a 4-year span, with no cause of death mentioned for any of them. A fire broke out at the Lalaurie home on the morning of April 10, 1834. The blaze originated in the kitchen and was rapidly spreading throughout the house. A crowd gathered to assist in fighting the fire. They entered the house and found a 70-year-old black woman chained to the stove. The cook told the fire marshal that she had set the fire in order to commit suicide because Delphine kept her chained up all day and punished her for the slightest infraction. In the attic above the kitchen, the first responders found a group of imprisoned enslaved people. The New Orleans Bee reported on April 11, 1834. The day after the fire. Upon entering one of the apartments, the most appalling spectacle met their eyes. 7 slaves more or less horribly mutilated were seen suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. These slaves were the property of the demon, in the shape of a woman. They had been confined by her for several months in the situation, from which they had thus providentially been rescued and had been merely kept in existence to prolong their suffering and to make them taste all that the most refined cruelty could inflict. It is commonly reported the horrors within included removed skin, broken bones set into peculiar positions, amputated limbs, exposed brain being stirred with a stick, and even someone unfortunate enough to have their lips sewn together, trapping animal feces in their mouth. Female slave owners had the authority and means of inflicting punishment both physically and psychologically on enslaved people. They could coerce male slaves into have sexual relations with them. If a slave resisted, a white woman could falsely accuse him of rape, which would result in severe punishment and even death. According to Captain Richard J. Hinton, an abolitionist commander in the Civil War, I have never found a bright-looking colored man whose confidences I have won, who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled, either by his mistress or by white women of the same class, to have connection with them. One former slave told Hinton that his mistress ordered him to sleep with her after her husband died.